Dear friends, I'm delighted to extend my warmest greetings to everyone gathered virtually today to participate in this important conversation on anti-Black racism and employment equity. International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination reminds us to stand up against all forms of racial discrimination, inequities, and intolerance. The Government of Canada has taken steps to advance equity over the years, but we know that more work needs to be done to eliminate persistent barriers. We also recognize that COVID-19 and the pandemic has amplified social and economic barriers experienced by Black Canadians, Indigenous peoples, and other racialized communities. This is why this event and dialogue on anti-Black racism and employment equity is important and timely. I appreciate the initiative to host this event by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and the Canadian Labour Congress. And I'm keen to hear about the discussion and to understand the ways in which the Employment Equity Act can better support Black Canadians. As you know, the Act is one of the ways the Government of Canada promotes equality and diversity in workplaces. We will soon launch a task force to conduct a comprehensive review of the Act. The task force will have a mandate to study, consult, and advise on how to modernize and strengthen the federal employment equity regime. A renewed Act will contribute to ensuring that Canada's economic recovery is fair and inclusive so that every Canadian can reach their full potential. Thank you for hosting this event, participating in this crucial conversation, and continuing to stand up against discrimination to fight racism in all its forms. Please accept my best wishes. Yours sincerely, the Honorable Philomena Tassi, Minister of Labour. Thank you, Minister Tassi, for your remarks. I personally know Minister Tassi herself really wanted to be here, and despite her wonderful staff, Hannah Campbell and others, jumping upside down to get her here, she was unable to attend. However, she has sent us a number of senior policy advisors who are working on this file here to take notes and hear the wisdom from all of you. In fact, we have a rather large gathering from the federal government attending today, including colleagues from the Canadian Human Rights Commission, Correctional Services, Status of Women, and the Senate. And also many unions, researchers, and provincial government employees, as well as community members. So thank you all for coming today. So let me put this event into context. The Employment Equity Act was supposed to be a guiding light to the way workplaces needed to operate. It was a vision statement to ensure women, Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, and visible minorities were provided greater opportunity to succeed economically. We have seen some successes over the last 25 years, but we still see many major gaps. Particularly, we know Black workers have not seen the gains this legislation intended to create. So today, we wanted to focus on them and really do a deep dive into asking, why not? Because we know when we intentionally include those who have been left out the most, we lift all of us up. We also know the limitations of the Act because it only directly applies to a fraction of Canada's working population. And the vast majority of workplace regulation actually comes from the provinces. However, we are at a very important junction. The opportunity to transform the Employment Equity Act is a once in a generation moment where we can put into the letter of law the vision by which we create an inclusive economy for workers of tomorrow. I hope that the new modernized Employment Equity Act will provide a strong benchmark for all the provinces to match and maybe even exceed. But we have a long road ahead of us to reach a new modernized Employment Equity Act. But let us be clear, this journey is a collective bargaining session and needs to be treated as such for all of Canadian society. There is significant tension though. From my 10 years working within the labor movement, most recently as a senior organizer at the Toronto York Regional Labor Council, I know that if it isn't written on paper, signed, sealed, and delivered, a promissory note or an equity statement isn't worth a dime. So on one end, I would love to see incentives and penalties for those entrusted with employing workers to create greater opportunities for equity-seeking groups. But on the other hand, government policy can only go so far into controlling the daily operations of a business. There are limits. So how do we actually create real accountability while striking the right balance? That's what we're here to find out today. So what we've done is gathered people of good faith from academia, from the labor movement, from the corporate sector to think and perhaps dream about a future that will be open to far more than before. And with that, I'd like to welcome the incredible Angelyn Francis from the Toronto Star to introduce our panelists and get the show on the road. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Angelyn Francis, and thank you, Mohammed, for the introduction. I cover equity and inequality at the Toronto Star, and I'm happy to be here to moderate this panel. And I'll start just by quickly introducing everybody, not getting into very deep bios or anything, so we could get right to the conversation. But first, we have Larry Rousseau, who is the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. We have Dana Sykes, who is the Education and Equity Coordinator for United Steelworkers. Declan Nichols, who is the Deputy Ombudsman at TD Bank. And Grace Edward Galabuzzi, who's a Politics and Public Administration Professor at Ryerson University. All right, and to start off, I think we should talk a little bit about how the Act initially came about. So the roots of it are in the 1984 Abella Commission, which was chaired by Judge Rosalie Abella. And the Abella Report became the foundation for the Employment Equity Act in 1986, and it was later amended in 1995, which is the version that we have now. And now 25 years later, there is talks about amendments and all of that to try to update it. So let's start off with Grace Edward. Can you please tell us a little bit about the creation of the Act and why this particular piece of legislation is needed and what kind of impact it's had on workers when it comes to achieving workplace equity?
Thank you, Angelyn, and thank you. And I must say that I'm very proud of you because I was part of your education journey at some point. And it's wonderful to see you doing such good work at the Toronto Star.
Forgot to say former professor.
So the Abella report, which was officially referred to as the report of the Commission of the Equality in Employment, the Commission of Equality in Employment that was released in 1984, the terms of reference for the report required the Commission to explore the most efficient, effective, and equitable means of promoting equality in employment for 4 designated groups: women, Aboriginal people, persons with disabilities, and racialized people. As well, it was to required it to look specifically at employment practices in 11 designated Crown and government-owned corporations. And it was at the outcome of the report specifically was that Judge Abella found that discrimination in employment was both rampant but systemic and required a systemic response. And she said, and I quote, that discrimination means practices or attitudes that have, whether by design or impact, the effect of limiting an individual's or group's rights to opportunities generally available because of attributed rather than actual characteristics. It is not the question of whether this discrimination is motivated by intentional desire to obstruct someone's potential or whether it is accidental by an accidental byproduct of innocently motivated practices or systems. If the barrier is affecting certain groups in a disproportionate manner, in a negative manner, it is a sign that the practices that lead to this adverse impact may be discriminatory. And so her response was to essentially suggest that we should undertake this employment equity project. And the idea, I guess, was to address particular evidence of employment discrimination, unequal employment outcomes, higher levels of unemployment, a sectoral concentration of the groups that she identified, the designated groups that she identified, and the outcomes of low income. The other thing to think about is the extent to which this disrupted access to equal employment undermines the ability of individuals to realize their full potential and participate fully in Canadian society, denies the benefit of benefits that would be accrued to the economy, both from the individual and their family, and denies the ability for the country to have a full human resource benefit from the talents of those people, and also the ability of employers to optimize human resource decisions. So another thing that I think is important to talk about here is the extent to which we need to understand discriminatory employment practices within the broader context of a society. They don't happen in a vacuum. So to fully understand them, we need to understand the extent to which discriminatory practices actually occur outside of employment in the rest of our lives, and in particular when it comes to people of African descent, how the reality, the historical reality of anti-Black racism has determined the value of Black labor and disrupted the ability of Black workers to be able to be employed equitably in the labor markets. Now, I guess we'll talk about this a bit later, but there's actually a difference since the Employment Equity Act of 1987, which, by the way, was brought in 86, which was brought in by a conservative government. At the time, in the mid to late 1980s, there was a broad across the ideological spectrum agreement that we needed a systemic response to the problem of employment equity. And so the legislation was brought in by a conservative government in 1986. There were limits to the legislation. Some of them Angeline has referred to, some of them Mohammed has referred to. One of the critical limits was that it did not require employers to set targets and goals. It simply required for employers to report and to have an employment equity plan, which could or could not have targets and goals. The idea was that we would use moral persuasion to force people, I guess shaming, to force employers to do their due diligence. The other critical deficit was the lack of an enforcement mechanism. And to this day, the issue of enforcement has never really been resolved. And it makes a difference. So the employment equity legislation that applies both to the federal government, federal regulated private sector, but also the federal corporations, actually does not require the federal government employers to do what it requires the private sector employers to do. And the critical difference is that if you look at the data today, over the, and I'll show this in just a moment, over the close to 20 years that it has been in force, there has been much more progress in the private sector than there has been in the federal in the federal government. And part of that, to some extent, has to do with the sort of the regularization of a regime that requires, at the very least, requires for the reporting of progress. And the 1995 version provided for audits by the Canadian Human Rights Commission.
And Grace Edwards, so let me stop you there for a second, because we are actually going to get into the data a little bit further on. But before we get too deep into all of the technicalities about the report, I wanted to give it to Larry for a second to outline specifically how these kinds of things affect Black workers. So can you talk a little bit about the kinds of specific inequities that Black workers can experience both today and historically, and what has been dealt with regards to the Act, and what is still a structural and systemic inequity for Black workers specifically, Larry?
Well, the inequities have, we know that the inequities have been in society since the very beginning of colonization, and that have gone from generation to generation. And what happens is that the inequities in society get replicated, get reflected in our workplaces. People don't leave their intolerances, their biases, prejudices, and racism at the door when they walk into the workplace. It's with them. And whether it's conscious or unconscious, it is there. So the fact that for generations, Black workers were always faced with limited number of employment opportunities. Automatically, it was assumed that they would take jobs, as porters or waiters or domestic servants, regardless of what their educational achievements were. so the white establishment who owned the businesses did not see them as see Black workers as a pool of workers that you would traditionally hire into the positions that white workers were having, especially in management and senior levels. The labor movement, however, as soon as we saw in the 20th century that the labor movement was being organized and that Black workers could either organize, their own unions, for example, the sleeping car porters, for example. We saw also seamstresses in the United States and in Canada organize. So there were trade unions where Black workers were seeing that they could, become more militant and fight for what they needed to get in the workplace, but it was always fighting tooth and nail, for what you needed to get. There are numerous examples of Black Canadians throughout the 20th century who gave blood, sweat, and tears to get the unions to get around to addressing their concerns. And to this day, it is still a challenge in many workplaces. So, when we look at what has happened over the past year, especially, that, it always takes a galvanizing moment. In the 60s, it was the civil rights movement. I call it civil rights movement 1.0. And then when we started to talk about the shootings in Ferguson, and then finally what happened with George Floyd, it's like we've moved into civil rights 2.0. And the problem is that the data is still telling us, what the people out on the streets are telling us as well. And what's happening out on the streets, you can, as I said earlier, you cannot divorce from what's happening in our workplaces. So Black workers continue to experience discrimination in the hiring process, even in places where we do have employment equity provisions in place. And even if you're reporting numbers, it's fine. We hire Black workers into positions and then they stay in that position or at that level. They're not moving up into the organization, and we're not seeing the kind of programs or applications that make sure that people are trained, that people do get the opportunities that other workers is taken for granted. So, I could go into a lot of statistics about, the differences between Black unemployment and white unemployment. Currently the 2016 census was showing us that Black unemployment rates were consistently higher. We're certainly going to see that in the 2021 census, which will occur later in the spring. 12.5% versus 7.7%. And we're going to see that it's probably going to be worse because of the pandemic, because who got laid off first, who had the first, wave of jobs that were eliminated? It was the service employees, it was the frontline workers. We know that. And we know that many industries are not going to be hiring these people back. So when the unemployment figures do come in for later this year, even as we go into the recovery, we're going to see major problems, and that includes in federally regulated workplaces. So I think without getting too much into the statistics, I'd like to say that the economic realities of Black workers in Canada continue to be stark. It's amazing that whether you are a first generation Black worker, that means you've just arrived, as an immigrant, or whether you are a third generation or more Black worker, it's the stats are there. It's not because you have been in this country for generations as a Black person that you are necessarily going to have a better outcome. It's just not being proven by what we're seeing. So the systemic racism that we're seeing is that, when we have labor market analysis by race and class, we have the systemic factors, which mean education, that is, and when we see in society that people are not having the same access to the educational opportunities as the mainstream, and that you can be stuck in these in these places, that's one aspect. But when we see people even having the educational opportunities, getting the opportunities to go into the private sector, the public sector at higher levels, we're still seeing the barriers, the ceilings are there, and there is one thing about this review that we're going to have to really look at, and that is the role, and I know we'll talk about this, of leadership in making sure that we're addressing these systemic issues and cultural issues within organizations that are continuing to be barriers. And I'll stop there because I could keep going on and on, but we have a lot to say. We have a lot to talk about.
Yes, indeed. So I'll give it back to Grace Edward for a moment too. Can you, because you already started talking a little bit about the little gaps and the failures within the act that aren't specific enough and aren't really addressing the real systemic and structural inequities. So could you outline a few that you would like to see more specifically addressed?
Yes, of course. So here's the thing. One of the things that we have to deal with is we have to deal with the question of whether, I went a little further. We have to deal with the question of whether we actually have enough data to be able to answer the question with regard to the federal government. Because what's happened with the federal government is that the racialized populations performance, particularly in the private sector, has actually not been that bad. So let me just show that. Let me just start. I wanted to talk about the indigenous population as well. So as you can see here, what I have on the screen is you
stop sharing your screen, Grace Edward.
Oh, I should stop sharing?
You have to start sharing, yeah.
Oh, I haven't shared?
You did, and then it stopped.
Oh. Give me a moment to figure out what might have happened there.
Actually, in the meantime, since you bring up data, I think, Dana, do you mind if I actually ask you while we figure out the screen share situation? Oh, wait. Here we go.
Yeah, here we are. Okay, can you see it now?
Okay. Yep, we see it, Grace.
Okay, great. So the point I was trying to make is that one of the things that we need to do with regard to having a clearer understanding of the impact of the Employment Equity Act on the Black population is to disaggregate the data. Because as we can see with the data from the private sector in particular, it's clear on the in the federal government. So I want to start out by saying this is the experience with the indigenous population. The experience is that they're underperforming the labor market availability data. So, but this is the experience with racialized populations in the private sector. Okay, it tracks with the labor market availability. There's a couple of things, and this is like since 1987 when the legislation was promulgated to 2018. So it tracks and it shows progress. And I think that's an important observation that we need to talk about. I need to provide a couple of caveats. One is that this is against 2016 data. Okay, so it's dated in terms of the availability data. Secondly, it does not effectively include the international qualifications. So there's a gap there because of the lack of inclusion of international qualifications. And this is a particular problem with populations like the Black population that have a significant component of that population that is immigrant. So, but having said that, what the data show is that there's a possibility here to demonstrate that the employment equity regime actually has a positive effect on the populations, on certain racialized population, not so much on indigenous population, definitely amongst women, because they outperform their availability in the labor market, right? And sort of not as much with persons with disabilities. We need, though, to be specific about what's happening with the Black population. So we need to disaggregate this data. So I would suggest that going forward, one of the things we want to do when the review happens is to provide a different scale so that we have a disaggregation of the experience. What Larry said is true, broadly speaking. We just did a report a couple of years ago that looked at this. Broadly speaking, the Black population tends to underperform the Canadian population in terms of unemployment, in terms of compensation, okay? 84 cents to the dollar, right? In terms of concentration in particular sectors, okay? So both particular sectors as well as classifications, okay? So there are lower classifications and they're concentrated in a narrow range of sectors that largely relates to, for instance, the service sector. So that experience, that is the experience of, as Larry said, that is the experience. Maybe, I don't know whether it was Larry who said this, but I think it was Mohammed. That is the experience of the overwhelming majority of Black workers, because the majority of workers fall under provincial jurisdiction. 88% of the workers fall under provincial jurisdiction. The federal jurisdiction only accounts for 12%, right? But I think the Employment Equity Act was actually a good experiment in that regard. So we took this 12%, right, and subjected it, the 12% of the workers and the employers are even fewer, we subjected them to this new regime. And what we have demonstrated is that where there was more obligation, right, in terms of shifting the obligation from the workers to the employers, there has been some progress. Where there was less obligation, like in the federal government, there has been less progress. In the federal government, the racialized workers are 5 points lower than their labor market availability, right? So the lack of obligation, the lack of requirement for them to meet certain obligations has actually led to a lack of progress in terms of changing the culture of the workplace and changing the access to opportunities for workers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Grace Edward, is it okay if we share these slides with participants afterwards?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask you to stop sharing your screen. Actually, I want to make sure we can bring Dana and Declan into the conversation right now. And I also forgot to reiterate that there's a Q&A function for all of the attendees. If you have your own questions, we'll have a portion at the end to be able to bring those up. But since you brought up data as well, Grace Edward, I wanted to ask Dana if you have anything to add about the need for what kind of improvements need to be made to this kind of data collection.
Great, thank you. And thank you also for the invitation to be on this panel. This is an amazing experience and I'm humbled by being here with such amazing speakers. Yeah, I thought about this question a lot because when I was pulling through, I'm like, okay, yeah, I need some more specific information about some of the challenges that are addressing Black workers in Canada. And if we're gonna be honest, if we're utilizing this information, and if I'm only looking at it from a base of what's provided in the employer's reporting out and what the act requires, I can't tell you anything specifically because we're not digging into the data. So yeah, it absolutely, there needs to be that disaggregated information. And I'm going to put that in a bit of perspective, especially because I'm from one of the largest attainment groups required within the act. And that's the attainment group of women. And so that's great that there is this mark, but also an employer can do their reporting out and see that there's deficits and they can put together their plan to address that deficit, but they're only putting together that plan with me in mind. There's not an intersectional lens on which women are not participating within the workforce. They're basing it on my experience of discrimination. They're not basing it on others' experience with discrimination. So it is, the surface level, yeah, people might be reaching a certain point, but unless we're digging deeper, unless we have more information, unless we're looking at our workplaces within that intersectional lens, we need to have more information and we need to have more strategies. And the one other thing I just wanted to add to that as well, in terms of being part of a labor movement, this information is important to us as well. This gives us an opportunity to look at where the deficits are in our workplace and look at some of the strategies that we can use, and also look at who we should be talking to address some of the challenges that workers are facing in the workplace, including bargaining for collective agreement language. Like, the labor movement has done a really good job historically in recognizing that there have been deficits. A lot of affiliates have included language with targets based on that. But we're also, human rights are evolving, we're evolving, and we need to actually see this act evolve as well to be more representative of our populations. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And for mentioning, because just to kind of summarize what's been said so far, it seems like there needs to be obviously more specific requirements and targets related to the Act for People, and an acknowledgement too of the fact that without them, sometimes the scales end up being tipped, and it seems like only women's issues are being addressed as opposed to the other 3 categories that have been listed, and even more categories that exist. But so now, as we talk a little bit more about how this is executed, I'll move it over to Declan and to talk a little bit about employers taking more proactive measures to improve these kinds of employment opportunities. What sort of measures are being applied in workplaces to meet these requirements, and what sort of like challenges are there from the leadership standpoint of actually implementing these, or what? I wonder if challenges is the right word, but for what reasons exist why people haven't done it as much as they should, I guess.
Sure. Thanks, Angela, for the question. I just want to echo Dana's sentiments again. Thank you for including me in such an important conversation with such great panelists. So I'm going to speak to you basically from a perspective of so for the company I work for TD, and what we've done and what we've put in place. Now, first, diversity and inclusion are core values at TD. It's embedded in leadership, talent acquisition, management strategies, learning and development programs, and it's integrated in our policies and practices. In fact, in 2019, we actually did a refresh of our diversity and inclusion strategy, focusing on 3 key objectives: our colleagues, our customers, and our community. One of the main pivotal pieces of the whole entire diversity and inclusion strategy is actually the creation of an Enterprise Inclusion and Diversity Leadership Council. Now, this is from the top of the house, and it's made up of senior members that lead the inclusion strategy, diversity and inclusion strategy. And notice I said they lead the diversity and inclusion strategies. They're not just members, they're just not attendees, they're actually leading it. And Larry hinted on this before, we're going to have a broader discussion on why that leadership is so important. The global head of the diversity leads our Center of Excellence that supports initiatives that come out of that council. And we focus on 6 main areas, one of them being the Black experience. These initiatives that come out of the council include training programs, awareness programs, development programs, mentorship and sponsorship. And these are all tools that are pivotal in order to help Black workers obtain the necessary training, the career development, the support, the sponsorship that is needed in order to successfully grow their careers and have a better insight on what's available for them at TD. Now, this is a big program. It's enterprise-wide, as I mentioned. Of course, it goes without challenges. We do definitely have challenges. I've already picked up the theme that we've been talking about, and I'm kind of going to dovetail on it. It's really regarding data. My former role, I worked in the Office of the Chief Data Officer for TD, so I know the importance of data. And where we run into problems right now is our employees self-identify, and that must be voluntary to measure the representation and the need to keep privacy of the results while trying to support members of those groups. So it's a difficult balancing act. So it's easy to know what to fix if we know what needs to be fixed. So, over the last couple of years, we have modified or enhanced the self-ID process. It is giving us better insight and driving a clearer picture of progress. It's definitely still work that needs to be done. And again, it's the theme we're talking about. If we can pull out segments of data that really articulate and give us the actual information we need, we can make informed decisions, target areas of opportunity, and make improvements. Without that type of data, we're still going to run into those challenges. So that's kind of where our perspective of what I think and how TD is actually implementing these changes within our workplace.
Thank you, Declan. I think the next question that I have is for everybody. I think we'll start with Larry. I wanted to ask a little bit, because it's come up, I think, in what everyone's already mentioned so far, that the implementation of the act sometimes can fall short in that, in the culture of a workplace, and then in workers and Black workers feeling like they're supported in the roles that they do attain or in attaining upward mobility, in all of that. So I wanted to ask a little bit about what role you folks think that leaders should be taking to make sure that there is retention and that Black workers are supported, and how should the Equity Act reflect that?
Well, that is the crux of the issue, and to really just completely segue from Declan's what Declan just told us. It has to start, but it also has to stop at the top. So it has to go from top to bottom, and then from bottom back up to the top. And it cannot just be, as Grace Edward was talking about, a numbers exercise. It can't be just a reporting exercise. It has to really be something that is embraced by the senior leadership, the top leadership of the organization, and then brought through, right through to all of the management levels and supervisory levels of the organization, so that when we are hiring, no matter what level we are at, that question of equity is there. We have an employment equity program that was really quite wildly successful in the federal government. And people don't think about it, but it was the bilingualism program. It was a program that was started to make sure that Anglophones and Francophones would be equitably treated. So we had Francophones who had statistics like we're seeing here, not represented in senior levels, completely underrepresented, and because of political will. If people go back to the 60s and the 70s and the separation movement and all the rest, because of that political will, the government put everything that they needed to put into, despite the intolerance of the mainly white Anglophones who said, why are we doing this French stuff? Which is what we'll see today. And what we've seen under the existence of the Employment Equity Act. Why do we have to give opportunities to these Black workers, to these workers of color, to Indigenous workers, to women, right? And that's the intolerance. So the model is there. And we've seen that when the will is there, when the money is there, and that the senior leadership, all the deputy heads, as well as the senior management of all the departments, as well as banks, et cetera, say, okay, we need to do this. It can work, but the Employment Equity Act never had those teeth. It never had that political heft. It never had that political weight behind it. And so it became something that went on the corner of most HR desks. And a box to be checked off, and that was it. So it can be done, but the leadership is extremely important in making sure that throughout the organization, when people aren't pulling their weight, when people are having practices of intolerance, you know, you're completely surrounded by a white team that resembles you, you know, either a man or a woman, and that you are not reaching out to diversify, you are not reaching out. Well, that has to be addressed, because if that's happening in that area, then it's happening elsewhere within the organization, and you're not going to make it to the finish line. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Larry. And I want to make sure we have time for audience questions too. So I'll kind of fast forward to the last and the main question, why we're all here, really. I'll reduce it a bit to try to keep everybody's answers concise, but I'm wondering, what is one specific change you would like to see to the Employment Equity Act, like as it's being revised? What's one thing that you would put forward as something that they should prioritize adding? And what would a measure of success look like after these changes are made? We can start with Grace Edward. Do you have, or if I'm putting you on the spot, let me know.
No, I'm good. Thanks. So actually, I have more than one. This is the unfortunate thing about this, because Larry is right that the act really fell short of the expectations. Bella's report was very sophisticated. It talked about both a quantitative and a qualitative response, right? We needed to have, so Bella's report reflected on the program that Larry talked about, okay? The integration of Francophones into the federal government and how successful it was, as well as the affirmative action program in the United States. So from the point of view of the United States, I was concerned about the sort of the delegitimization of the process. And so she said, let's not call it affirmative action, let's call it employment equity as opposed to affirmative action. From the point of view of the Francophone program, what she took was this idea that, as is in business, the client would probably agree with me, as is the case in business, that to get the outcomes that you want, you often need to target your objectives, okay? You have targets and you use those targets to get the outcomes. That's exactly what happened with the federal Francophone program. So she said, we need targets. Targets allow us to be able to measure progress and outcomes, right? So A, we need targets. Two, we actually do need enforcement. The difference between the private federally regulated sector and the federal government shows very clearly that if you have obligations, people will meet obligations. And if you have enforcement, some level of enforcement, people will actually do better. So we need enforcement, and we need actually strong enforcement going forward. In this moment, in the moment in which Black lives, we understand more and more that Black lives actually matter. And we understand that, particularly during COVID, that there is a fatal effect when we do not deal with employment equity, because black workers are at the bottom, last hired, first fired, and Black workers. I mean, I have data to show that in Toronto, for instance, Blacks are 9% of the population. They represent 34% of the cases of COVID workers. Guess why? Because of the way they work, because of where they are in the labor market, right? That kind of gross disproportionality needs to be dealt with through a legislated, an effective legislative process, and employment equity does represent that. So we need targets, we need enforcement, but we also need something on the qualitative side, a commitment to change the culture of the workplace. So when Larry says that I have sat in many of these meetings, I am sure that many of you have sat in many of these meetings, where the overwhelming majority of the people are either white men or white people. And there's one or two people of color, or Black people or Indigenous people. People need to be conscious of the fact there's something wrong with that picture, okay? So on the culture side, we need to change. The other reason we need to change that is because some groups do not necessarily, when you talked about intersections, some groups will not necessarily be most effectively integrated using numbers. So LGBTQ members, for instance, we need to address the question of changing the processes, the sort of the qualitative processes by which we both determine who gets access to interviews, how people are interviewed, and who, this is where the targeting comes in, and who gets to the next level of being hired and promoted.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. And Dana, what is one change that you would implement, and how would you measure success for it?
I think right now the current requirements is that employers are reporting if they're reaching those deficits, that they put together a plan. But I would agree that enforcement is a key piece. But I also think that there does need to be penalties, or I don't know, perhaps an incentive, but something to acknowledge that, yeah, that's great that you have a plan, but we actually have to get there, and we're not gonna reach any level of equity with just a plan. We actually need action.
Awesome. And Declan, do you have anything to add about what is a specific change you'd like to see in this update?
Yeah, sure. That's going to be a theme I've already hit on. It's data. Improve the ability to collect data to gain better insight on the initiatives. So allow those companies employers to be able to collect that data that's needed, so that they can appropriately target areas that are not meeting expectations. I think having that a little bit more freedom with that through the act, I think will help improve. And I think, when I'm looking at what does success look like, and a lot of you have hit it on here, is really seeing more Black representation in upper management, seeing companies develop and implement employee equity plans that go beyond the bare minimum of the act. I mean, when you look at any type of rule or legislation, they set up the bare minimum. You should always be striving to go above the bare minimum, strive to be better and develop plans and strategies to improve and go beyond. So I think that's something that from a cultural perspective that needs to happen. And again, as Larry touched on, that really stems from leadership. That leadership will build that culture. That culture will support that movement, and that movement will get the really, the dial moving.
Thank you. And Larry, what are your final thoughts?
Very quickly, of course, I'm coming from the Canadian Labour Congress perspective, and I think it's very important for us to remember that employment equity cannot just be a management-driven process where people are speaking to people who are reflecting what they're thinking and what they want to do. We need to have diversity of opinion. So I know that, the task force is going to be going out and getting people, on board to look at this, but labor participation. And that means that when the Employment Equity Act is put into force, we have to look over the past 30 years, and we have to look at how the Employment Equity Act fell, not only in terms of how the bargaining agents, interacted with the Employment Equity Act, but how about collective bargaining to start with, and how does it really matter that we do have labor participation. So we have labor management committees that look at what's going on in the workplace. If you have and too many places that are unionized have very weak labor management committees, all right? And those need to be reinforced, but the Employment Equity Act needs to have provisions that say, here are the bargaining agents, here are the representatives of the employees, all right? We need to have them within the process to make sure that it's not always, confrontational, and that the unions are reacting to things such as numbers and reports, but that the unions actually are having input into how the employment equity plans are going to be implemented and operate within our organizations. For non-unionized places such as, TD, I'm sure that there is something kind of equivalent where they can go out and solicit the opinions of the workers in their organizations. But we have much of the federal workplace is unionized, and we have to remember that.
Angeline, can I just add one quick thing?
Yeah.
Yes. I just want to add that I absolutely agree with Larry about the labor management role, right? but because the overwhelming majority of the workplaces are not unionized, I think the way we need to frame it is worker participation, so that we do not have a decision around the plan, the target, without workers being involved in every workplace, without workers being involved. I think that is a really critical thing. The other thing is that we need to broaden the frame to include the obligations for anti-racism strategy at a pan-Canadian level. That might be the way through which we push the federal government provides leadership to the provinces to also undertake responsibility doing employment equity, because we've lost ground over the last 15 years around the question of employment equity, and we need to recover that ground, especially in this moment of Black Lives Matter. We need to recover that ground and ensure that the provinces assume the responsibility of creating an employment equity regime.
Yes, Grace Edward brings up a very good point of just 30 seconds. And it is that the Employment Equity Act, in addition to being a numbers exercise, in addition to making sure that we have things in place to make sure that people are moving up the ladder, we need to address the cultural aspects within organizations. In other words, a kind of a health report card, you know, about how intolerance is operating within an organization. How is racism, you know, and have those difficult discussions to say, hey, you know what? We have a lot of unconscious bias going on in this organization. How are we going to, so because if those biases are there, how can you get managers to really embrace employment equity if they're not dealing with the fundamental problem of intolerance within the organization? Very quickly.
I muted myself by accident. Very quick point, or very good point. Thank you all. And we have a few questions from the audience. We'll try to get to as many as we can. I'll direct them at all panelists, but just maybe raise your hand and frame if you're about to start answering, so you don't step on each other too much. But there were a few questions kind of around wanting to know a bit more about why, what difference it will make in distinguishing the different groups that they're trying to target. Like, for example, specifically having targets for Black people or whatever other group. If anyone wants to talk a little bit about what kind of an impact and how the outcome will change if we more specifically target these different groups instead of having a very broad reaching description for everybody.
I think the reality of racism is that it is complex, okay? And it is articulated differently to different groups, right? Some people would argue Black people have been in Canada for 400 years, right? Should it not be the case that they should be thriving? But part of the reason why they're not thriving, part of the reason why we're here where we are today and having this conversation is because those 400 years actually determined how people understand Blackness. And Larry spoke to this earlier on, how people understand Blackness, how people act upon Black people. There's a penalty, right, that is specific to Blackness. And so the reality is that it is possible to, quote unquote, integrate workplaces and concentrate that integration in particular racialized groups and leave some others behind. We don't want that. And the only way we know that is or is not happening is if we do what Declan was saying, collect the data, disaggregate the data, and know very clearly how these programs are impacting every particular group with its particular historical experience with racism.
And I don't.
Yeah, go ahead, Dana.
Sorry, because we have been talking about the data a lot, and I think the data is very, very important, but the data also doesn't reflect individual experience, and it doesn't reflect how people are experiencing life in their workplace, and it looks at people as targets and averages. And I think the conversation does need to go beyond the data as well, and talk about that worker experience. But yeah, I just want to be mindful of that, and especially like going back to that gendered lens of it. from what I see from the data being reflected, it isn't as intersectional as it could be, and it doesn't reflect the experience of all women in the workplace. And that is a conversation that does need to happen, because unfortunately, even the women's movements and people who have pushed for these changes are not necessarily taking into consideration the different needs of different women.
Go ahead, Declan. I think.
Dana kind of was the theme I wanted to talk about, and I want to give us enough time so we can get to some more questions as well.
Yeah, so very quickly, I think Dana touched on intersectionalities, and that kind of goes back to what I was talking about, within the organization, we also have to recognize the intersectionalities that are operating, between, like if I'm Black and I'm gay, how is that operating in the workplace? So, and because I have different realities than someone who's Black and straight, okay, in the workplace. So how does that operate, and how does the organization recognize our intersectionalities and deal with our intersectionalities as well, which help foster that culture that we need of respect and finally equality?
Thank you all. And there's one question that was, I don't think any of you necessarily need to speak to it, but I just want to mention it in case anyone in the audience, it stirs up anything for them. But they mentioned a federal government program called Racism-Free Workplace Strategy that was funded, but the Harper government stopped funding, and I was wondering about the possibility of programs like this returning. Which I don't think necessarily any of you need to speak to.
Let me say, I actually was one of the people who reviewed that program. The unfortunate thing is that it had very positive reviews because it dealt with the supporting employers, dealt with the qualitative side of things that we've been talking about, right? But then the government made the decision to discontinue it because of an issue of commitment. A government with more commitment, with a commitment to ensuring that employment equity actually works, would probably establish a program of that nature and other programs of that nature. The Abela report, for instance, talked about the need to look at the other dimensions, for instance, childcare, right? Then I was talking about childcare, right? Larry was talking about education. The other dimensions that make it possible for us to achieve equity in employment. And all those are really important. And that's why programs like Racism-Free Workplace was actually an important one.
That's a very good point that didn't come up as yet. The feeder issues that feed into why some people are disadvantaged in the workplace. If you don't have the education, if you don't have childcare support, how is it that you can get these jobs in the first place? And I think one of the last, let's make this the last question so no people don't have to stay too late, but somebody was asking about how can we concretely quantify the impact on a company or an organization that doesn't embrace diversity at large, and what does the financial impact, what are ways that we can concretely quantify this? And I'm not sure if they mean for the organization itself or as part of the rule book within the act, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll just add here, again, and speaking from our experience here at TD and Grace Edward talked about is having those targets, without having a plan and a set goal on what you want to achieve, regardless of what program or you put in place, you're just going to be spinning without getting any real results if you cannot trace it to, well, am I being successful? Are we targeting the right area? So really, and I hate to keep kind of harping on it, but again, it goes back to the leadership and culture of the actual business in order to develop, make sure they have a sound plan with those targets and that makes sense. It's almost to a point of self-policing within the corporation. I know we heard some talk here about with the act, do we look at, the kind of the carrot and the stick approach? Do we look at, all right, do we need these harsh penalties? Do we have incentives? I think there's probably an opportunity for a combination of both. But at the end of the day, it really focuses on the real ownership is on the leadership of those companies, the leadership within government to put appropriate plans in place that will make this a successful endeavor, and that you can really track and understand what that success looks like. And that's my perspective.
So let me just add that we actually do have some tools that we can use to quantify the either positive or negative impact of discrimination in employment. There's a lot of work that's been done in the United States. There's some work that's been done in the Canadian context. We have not sort of narrowed it to the micro units like firms, right? We are looking at sectors, but it is possible to do a sector like banking sector. It's also possible probably to do one banking institution, right? So it is not impossible, if we do have some data, for us to be able to derive the impact or the effect of both discrimination and the positive effect of an intervention like employment equity.
Speaking of tools, the federal government has an employee opinion survey that it affects I think it's every 3 to 5 years or something. I can't remember the interval. And what we can't continue to accept is that when you've achieved a 76 or a 77% level of satisfaction amongst your employees, that you're going, yay, this is great, because you have 25% of your folks who are not happy. And it's almost as if you're saying, well, we can deal, we can live with that. Okay. You know, when the objective needs, we need to get up into the 90s, and that 100% target is where we have to go, so that we have no harassment. You know, it's great to talk about zero tolerance, you know, but when you're talking about that you're tolerating a 75 or a 76 satisfaction rate within your organization, don't talk to me about zero tolerance for harassment, for discrimination, and for what people are saying makes a very toxic workplace.
Larry, especially because if that 25% is concentrated amongst particular groups.
There you go.
No, that's an excellent point, Larry. I mean, just think about it for businesses in the private sector. Let's flip it. Would you be happy if 25% of your customers are unsatisfied?
Good heavens.
No, exactly. So it should be treated the same way for your employees. Absolutely.
Wow, Declan. Okay.
Awesome. And Dana, do you have anything to add before we sign off?
Right.
No, I just want to say again, thank you for this opportunity. I think, we've got a lot of work to do, and lots of consulting and a lot of conversations, and this, even being here today, has opened up my eyes a lot. So I just want to thank everybody else as well on the panel, because there's just a reminder, it's Friday, but we still have a lot to do.
Final word, let's make sure that the task force looks like, and I'm talking about whether you're looking at civil society organizations, private sector employers, public sector employers, union representation, that the task force actually looks like where we need to go in terms of being able to consult everyone who is involved in this. Okay.
And let me also add that unionization is an important other dimension of what we need to set as goals, because unionized workplaces tend to work better on all of the issues that we're talking about, including the potential for negotiating employment equity plans, but also better wages, better working conditions, and better retention of workers, of racialized workers.
And the unions have to do a better job as well of representing their marginalized workers. And we know that, but we've got work to do on that aspect as well. What a great conversation.
Honestly,
absolutely.
So much happens, so much needs to be done. And thank you all so much. Thank you to all the panelists and all the attendees for joining us today. I'll give it back to Mohammed as well.
No, I just wanted to say thank you, Angeline, for hosting this great debate. It's a great conversation. This is going to be a long journey for everybody. You know, once the task force is named, then they start doing their work, and I promise you, we'll come back to all of you, all the people and the participants. We'll try to follow up. Grace Edward has kindly agreed to share his slides, So we'll flip that over to you. I believe Sharon has everybody's email addresses, whoever signed up for today, and we'll get that over to you. But on final, I just want to say thank you. This is the first of, I hope, many conversations. And the road needs to be seen as one that we need to build. We can't see that we looked at it and said, we've done good here, we've done bad here. How do we tinker here and there? We need dramatic change. We need something that's going to change and be a visionary statement, and not just a statement of a commitment towards making the employment fairer, more accessible, and better for everybody in Canada. Thank you very much for coming, everybody, and we will see you soon. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye.